All right, I have hit record. So one more time, you're at the YA Virtual Author event with Frisco Public Library. My name is Jen, and I am one of the librarians here at Frisco. And I have my two team partners here with me, Sahasra and Bianca, and they're going to help me interview these lovely authors that have agreed to join us for about an hour and a half to discuss their work, being an author, tricks and tips and all kinds of that sort of thing as well. So we're going to dive right in, and just to let you guys know, please keep yourself on mute. And if you have questions, put them in chat. And we are going to have a question period towards the end. So let me get started. I want to introduce, we have Dana Swift, Leslie Lutz, and KayLynn Flanders with us today. And we're going to start off with a bio of each author, and then we'll jump in with questions. So I'm going to start with Dana, and let me just read your bio really quickly for our listeners. So Dana Swift started making up fantasy worlds when she was 11 years old and hasn't stopped since. She graduated from the University of Texas at Austin, where she earned degrees in English and advertising. While in college, Dana competed as a saber fencer and learned a thing or two about fighting, parrying, and how it feels to fall in love with your sparring partner. She currently lives with said husband in Miami, Florida. Her YA fantasy debut, Cast in Firelight, was published in January. It's awesome. And the sequel, Bound by Firelight, will come out in January 2022. Thanks for being with us, Dana.
Thank you for having me. This is wonderful.
Awesome. Okay.
Following up, we have Leslie Lutz, who is a devoted fan of scuba diving and creature horror. Her poetry and fiction have appeared in various journals, including Typishly, Cater Basin Literary Journal, Orca, the Lyric, and Raintown Review. She draws on her volunteer experiences, including her time teaching GED courses at the Atlanta Women's Prison, to tell stories that challenge stereotypes about forgotten people. She lives in Fort Worth, and when she's not writing, you can find her watching B-horror movies, taking care of chickens, or searching for the next perfect dive. Also, what's really interesting is that Leslie won the 2018 Frisco First Chapter contest for Fractured Tide. This gave her the confidence to pitch her novel and eventually find an agent.
Hi, it's so great to be here today.
Sahasra, you're still muted.
Okay, one sec. I think my mic has some problems. Okay, can you guys hear me now?
We can. Speak up just a little bit if you can.
Okay, last but certainly not least, we have KayLynn Flanders. She has a degree in English language and editing and has been a freelance editor and book designer for over 12 years. Her debut novel, Shielded, was published by Delicate Press, or PRH, with the sequel, Untethered, coming out on July 20th. KayLynn loves libraries, reading, writing, traveling, and volleyball, and thinks there's nothing better than a spur-of-the-moment road trip.
Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Okay, so Dana, could you start by telling us a little bit about your book, Cast in Firelight?
Yeah, so this is the book. Came out about 5 months ago, and it's about two teens arranged to be married who don't like each other very much. That's to do with the first chapter where they meet and she slaps him in the face. And then 9 years later, they meet again, mistakenly not realizing who they are, and they partner up to defeat the crime lords of the country, all the while as vigilantes, all the while not knowing who they're partnering with and who they might be falling for.
Ms. Lutz, for those who haven't read the book, how would you best describe it? Do you think there's like a word or a phrase that succinctly captures the essence of Fractured Tide?
You know, I think that one of the things, oh, is my audio working? Because my picture's not quite coming up. It's working?
Yes.
Okay. I think one of the things that that captures it the most is the idea of an eerie thriller. If it's not one word, but if I were to give a quick pitch for the book, well, it basically, my main character Sia has been diving her entire life. And when her family's charter ends up going out on a dive to go take tourists to see some pretty fish, everything goes wrong. There's a terrible accident that has to do with a sea monster. That is not, spoiler, that happens pretty early. And Sia and 3 other survivors end up on a deserted island in the Florida Keys. And now she thinks that getting home is all about finding water and making a big signal fire. But when she starts seeing time loops on the island, she realizes it's going to take a lot more than a big help sign on the beach to get her home.
For anyone who hasn't read Shielded, how would you describe it?
Yeah, it's okay. I'll do what Dana did. Pull it up. That's the cover. It's basically about a princess who has been forced to hide her magic for her whole life. But when these evil ancient mages escape from their prisons and come after her and her family, she has to figure out how to use this magic that she's kept in her whole life in order to protect those that she loves. It's got hidden identities, and it's a little bit of romance, a really menacing forest, and it's a lot of fun. All right, excuse me. So Dana, we're going to come back to you. Next question is, could you see yourself reflected in the characters of cast in Firelight?
Yeah, some of them. I feel like as an author, we have to like start somewhere, and normally that's with ourselves. So a lot of Adra's best qualities, I wouldn't say came from me. She's very brave, and I just live my life not that brave and not that selfless. But her insecurities, I really drew from my own insecurities, even with writing. And, you know, will one day I get published? I kind of dug deep in those feelings and gave those to her. She has a very feeling of inadequacy and competence. And so she struggles with that through the book. That's kind of her character arc. So yeah, all those emotions really came from me. A lot of the characters, I would say, like their deepest emotions and insecurities came from something I've experienced in my own life.
Awesome.
I'd like to pose a similar question to you as well, Mrs. Lutz. Did you end up finding that there are like characteristics of people you know in your everyday life, and you use those characteristics to develop characters within Fractured Tide?
Yeah, I definitely did that. I think, so Sia is writing this story. The whole story is a long letter, almost like a message in a bottle. And she's writing it to her father. And I think that I drew a lot of characteristics from my own father when I was thinking about him. Now her father's in prison. My dad was not in prison, but he was one of those people who he took me under his wing and in ways that I just always cherish. And the way he tried to teach me to be strong, that just meant a lot to me. And for Sia, while she's on this island, her memories of her father and her writing this story to her father really is part of what keeps her alive and grounded. So I definitely drew from my own father. And there's a character, so she has a love interest on the beach. His name is Ben, and he's an amalgam of various attractive people I've met. But his ex-girlfriend is also on the island. And I think I drew from various mean girls I've known in my life. But one of the things I ended up doing, which was interesting for me to experience, is that I also had to make Steph, this ex-girlfriend, human. She's not very interesting if she was just this two-dimensional mean girl. But she has her own issues. She has a family that ignores her. She has problems at home that have kind of pushed her in the direction of being a bully. So I think diving into that was interesting for me because I had to think about the bullies in my life and think, oh, well, why did they end up this way? And then, of course, there's a character, her little brother is 7. And I definitely drew from my own daughter, who is currently 9, but she was 7 when she was 6 or 7 when I was writing this. And I just imagined, what would it be like to be in, such dangerous conditions with a child who's dependent upon you. So, and a lot of her sweetness and love of small natural things definitely came that went into the character of Sia's younger brother.
So this is sort of a general question to all of you, but Shielded is your first book to be published, right, Ms. Flanders? So how do you think publishing it has changed your writing process now that you have a book published?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I feel like I know myself better now. I feel like I know my writing habits. I trust myself more with like making that first draft and letting it be messy. I trust my revision process more. I kind of feel like I know what my voice, like I'm more confident in my voice and writing books that sound and feel like a KayLynn Flanders book, right? And my process is a little bit more streamlined. I feel like I've gotten better at writing over the process of writing the book and then having it published, and really learning to just take confidence in the fact that I love the book that I've created, and not everyone will love it the same that I do, but that's okay.
Also, so focus back on like the writing process and whatnot. In general, for authors and for you guys as well, what factors do you have to take into consideration for your audience, and how does that end up shaping the draft or like the course of the novel?
That's a great question.
Okay,
Do you want to go ahead, Dana?
It's funny because when I first wrote it, I wrote it for myself because I never knew if it would be published. So I kept thinking, what do I want to read? And now that I've written a second one that has an audience, I'm much more thinking like, what does the audience want? And I don't know if it's the best to always frame the writing in that way. I think writing for yourself sometimes is the best for first drafts at least. And then like maybe you can edit it to what's best for an audience. But I don't know, especially if you're a writer out there listening, write for yourself. I think that's the best advice.
You know, I think Dana makes a great point about when you first start writing, definitely you're writing for almost for yourself as an audience. But I also think that I like to think of my book as it's a communication with this audience, and the book doesn't almost exist entirely until it gets to the audience, if that makes any sense. But one of the things I thought about, I have a tendency to go kind of dark when I write, and sometimes for a younger audience, going too dark might not be the right thing. So I tempered that in the revisions. It was definitely a much darker story, much more Lord of the Flies. When I first wrote it, Steph was almost, she's a sociopath bully. The bully was really terrible, barely human, and terrible things happened to the main character. And I softened that over time because I wanted there to be an uplifting ending, that although they went through so much, that there was light at the end, that there was something good. And they didn't come out of it all in one piece, but there is something that it's at the end of it, you feel good about the book, especially when you're younger and you're reading, and you might not want that Stephen King ending.
Sorry, you guys, I had trouble unmuting before. So I think this is, Dana, I'll ask this specifically of you, but I think that probably everyone could answer this one. What is a novel or author who has influenced you in your writing with your cast in Firelight particularly, but also with your other books as well?
Yeah, so when I was younger, my favorite book, and my favorite book today, is Anne of Green Gables. And I loved how Anne just had this like imagination, and it was the best thing about her. And I had a big imagination when I was young, so I love that about her. But then as I grew up, Harry Potter, of course, has always been like influential, even though I don't agree with what J.K. Rowling. So I don't want to say she's a role model, but Harry Potter in general, like the fantasy and that wonderment, I really wanted to evoke in my own writing. So I love writing fantasy worlds with like visual and vivid magic and things like that. But then as I've grown, other fantasy authors, Brandon Sanderson, for instance, I really love how he does these big climactic moments in his YA and adult. So I've drawn on that as well. My weakness as a writer when I was first starting was story structure. So a lot of times writing these other books and realizing how to make sure the story didn't slow down too much or speed up too fast. I really look to other fancy writers for that kind of experience and inspiration.
Leslie or KayLynn, did either of you have that kind of influence?
Yeah, like, so growing up, Jane Eyre was a book that I read a lot. It became like my comfort book, and it's like a big book, but I was like, I couldn't read it all the time, but I would reread it over Christmas break during the school holidays. And I would reread it and just felt this kinship with the characters in it. I also really loved the plot twist in Ender's Game. Like, that probably was the first book that I read where the plot twist like blew my mind. Like, I didn't realize that a plot twist could do that. Ella Enchanted was like, the romance in that book is so like gentle and sweet but deep, and I really appreciated that. So those are some of the books that really made an impact on me when I was growing up that I think I have carried over into my own writing style as well.
Yeah, I have a ton of influences. Speaking of childhood influences, I was a huge fantasy reader, and I read Terry Brooks. I don't know how many of you have read Terry Brooks, and part of what I loved about his writing was that there was this journey through nature, and you know, it was just humans versus nature, but there was also magic and monsters. I read a lot of Tolkien. Then when I was writing this book, I was influenced definitely by Stephen King. There's a story called The Mist that is not for the faint of heart, but I studied the monster scene, and there's a monster scene with tentacles that I studied several times because it's so well done and terrifying. And I wanted to see if I could do something like that when I have a monster attack scene that I wanted to. But I love Stephen King, the way he creates dread. And there's another author, I also really like The Hunger Games. I think that Suzanne Collins is a great writer. She's great at voice-driven action and pacing. She's great. There's an adult author called Jeff Vandermeer who wrote a book called Annihilation that very much influenced me when it came to writing dread. And I wanted my story to have a lot of thriller, dread elements where there's this feeling of something wrong, and the main character couldn't quite put her finger on it. And I definitely drew from him. It was if you haven't read Annihilation, I recommend it. It's a really good book.
Okay, I'm gonna be jumping around a little bit. So previously we talked about how we take into consideration our audiences in writing. So I was wondering, I read an article recently about how this artist felt like taking into consideration their audience would result in them censoring their own work. Have you ever felt that maybe writing for a teen audience would result in you losing details you wanted to be included?
The only thing for me right away that censors is sometimes in the first draft, like I'll use a curse word and then I'll be like, no, let's backtrack that. So just in maybe like word choice every once in a while. And like Leslie said, like the darkness, like how dark. I mean, YA can go so dark now that truthfully, it feels like it's just like what makes a YA book is just like that characterness, that like voiciness, the fast pace. It doesn't even feel like content is a limiting factor anymore, but I do feel like cursing for me is one of those things because I worked as a bookseller. And so when I was in like the Plano, Frisco area, a lot of times like 12-year-olds would come into the YA section. And I always want my book to be accessible to all YA, not just like upper YA. So I wanted to make sure like a 10-year-old would be safe reading it in some ways. But that's a really good question. I'm excited to see what KayLynn and Leslie say.
Yeah, for me, that's a really interesting question. When you think about like censoring something, and for me, I really try to stay true to myself, and I try to stay true to who I am. And I feel like the thing that gets like censored the most is my adult gaze. because like I am 35 and I am not a teenager. I've learned a lot of things since I was a teenager. So sometimes it's a matter of like, it's not about what I think or what I would do or how I would react. It's how would teenage me handle that, or how would like sort of taking the age down and the experiences that I've had since then. And just making sure that we see through the main character's lens with like 16, 17, 18 years of experience and not 35 years of experience, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I know that I've had my beta readers on the book would warn me when I started to sound, not like a teenager. And hey, you've got to remember this is not the way teenagers think, and then I'd have to put myself in the right mindset. But for me, the publisher who published Fractured Tide is HarperCollins, and the imprint is called Blink, and they have a very specific language rules because they try to market, they call it clean YA. I don't know if, but it got marketed. We looked at a lot of different publishers, but we ended up liking this one. And there was no cursing allowed at all in this particular imprint. So I had just a couple that got edited out. But honestly, I used to teach 7th grade, and I had a lot of precocious 7th graders who could read on an 11th grade level, but they weren't emotionally ready for adult content. And so I think when I write, I'm often writing for that super, I think of, would my 7th graders back then, would they have been able to read this, or would they have shut it because the language would have made them uncomfortable? And so I think I would have edited that out anyway, just because it's actually an interesting challenge. If you're trying to show frustration from your character, can you do it without profanity? And it forces you to be a little more creative. Can you get the voice, the frustration, the attitude without those crutch words? So it's a new puzzle to solve while you're writing.
I do feel though, as a teen, like how I express my frustration, like was through some cursing, like if I was talking to my friends, and now like I take out frustration in a different way and I'm more articulate, but like as a teen, I did curse. So it is funny that like some imprints, don't allow it.
Yeah.
Going back to like mentions about like the pacing of a novel and whatnot, as general advice for any aspiring writer, what is your recommendations for essentially like creating a plot line? Do you usually have like a full-fledged plan and a complete plot outline of like the basic key events that you want included in your novel? Or is it something that you continue to develop on and on as you keep writing chapter by chapter?
Yeah, I can answer that. I definitely do not have an outline before I begin. And I think if I could do that, my life would be easier. But when I've tried to write from an outline, it just comes out, I don't know, my stories would come out wooden. So what I try to do instead is start with character and situation. So I've got a character and she has this internal issue. She has a problem. She has, emotional wounds. And you kind of need to know that going in. And then here's my what if scenario. What if there was an island lost in time and a scuba diving charter ended up crashing and, being exploded and you end up with survivors on the island? What would happen? And so I went in with that and let that question guide me, and also let what the character's internal issues were, because I knew I would need to resolve those at some point. And I wanted to resolve those in the climax. So that affected what the climax was going to be. I actually had a different climax and realized, oh, that doesn't really match up with what my character needs to solve her internal conflict. So I changed it so that it would kind of dovetail. But yeah, I'm more of a pantser, although I try not to go in blind, because then you could write yourself into corners and spend a lot of time writing a manuscript that won't work. So those guiding questions about character and problem, motivation, those are really helpful.
I'll add on to that. I really love everything that Leslie said about character and focusing on the character and the conflicts like within your character. For me, I do that work, and then I also outline just because I feel like if I know what I'm writing toward, it's a little less scary to look at a blank page. Blank pages are like my nemesis. I'm really like, revision is my sweet spot, but drafting new words is really hard for me. So having like knowing my characters and then knowing where those characters are going is really helpful for me to be able to be excited about what I'm writing out and not get like lost on a tangent that isn't going to lead to where I want it to go.
Yeah, I'm like Leslie more than KayLynn in that I'm a pantser. I just have the idea of the climax, but the middle is like, who knows? Let's go through it together. And especially for book 2, I had this idea and then someone posed a different scenario and I went, let's just change everything. So I like in the middle, especially like things changing and not being, not having an outline where I feel like I have to follow and but I'm always following like what the characters would do. So a lot of times in Cast and Firelight, I was constantly rewriting how they found out and when they would find out. And a lot of times my characters were like, I'm smarter than this. We can't wait till the last page, Dana. And so I'm like, okay. So like I would have to change it. And it was just listening to character more than like me trying to, you know, outline versus pants. But yeah, a lot of things I love in revision though is going through with that hands and knowing what I want now and what paths I've taken and what I can change. But sometimes after it's published, like I'll listen to reviews and they'll be like, yeah, it could have gone this way. I'm like, you're right, it could have. And then I start planning entire new, like, yeah, if that had deviated, then I could have done this. So sometimes I just like, I would love to like workshop with people with my story, but sometimes you can't until it's a full first draft.
You know, another thing that I do when I'm planning is I get very attached to a certain image or a collection of images. So for Fractured Tide, I had this image of this scuba charter and these tentacles sort of coming up over the sides. And then I also had this image of a sinkhole and these divers descending into this dark sinkhole with their lights and how beautiful and kind of eerie that would be. And so I get attached to images, just the image of the beach, the way this palm trees would move, and I would say, well, that has to be in there. Or she would be diving or free diving in this certain area of the reef that's just magical. I thought, oh, I've got to get that one in there. So I mean, I feel inspired and drawn towards those images, and sometimes I get so drawn that I will include a scene that might not, when my drafting, that might not have actually worked, and I had to cut it and then take the image and try to put it in a different scene that would work, so because I would want to keep it. So yeah, imagery for me is very important.
And then sometimes just like a line of dialogue or like banter, I'm like, I have to fit this in somehow. I actually had this great like sequence and then I had to take it out because it didn't fit anywhere. And then when my editor wanted me to add a scene in Cast and Firelight, I like was like, this is the moment. And I put it in there and she's like, oh, it's great. Yeah, more banter. And I'm like, I got it in there. And for those who read it, like, it's the scene where they joke about like how many sky gliders Adira's had in her lifetime. So yeah, that was written like while I was just working out the gym, and I was like, I need this in there, but I got it in there, but only after my editor like allowed me that scene.
Well, could we maybe talk about perspective for just a little bit? Because you guys all kind of have a different sort of structure. Like Dana, you've got the alternating perspectives. Leslie, your character is writing that letter basically. And then KayLynn, you've got kind of a straightforward narrative that I think a lot of people would be really familiar with, but then you've got these little scenes that are totally something different. I don't want to, like give away any plot lines or anything, but I thought that was a really interesting contrast. And how did you guys decide that's how you were going to share your stories? Anybody can go first.
Should I go first? I can go first.
Yeah, you can go first.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, part of choosing a point of view for me is thinking about what will serve the story the best, if that makes sense. So if you've got like a wide sweeping epic, a story more about the world, sometimes third person point of view is better. But for me, like, I really wanted to be close to Jenna, and I really wanted to be like with her every step of the way. And so I felt like first person was the best way to do that. But she's only one person, and there's a lot happening in other places in the world, right? And so I kind of took a little note from Ender's Game. If you've read that book, it starts out with these like really confusing like little snippets that are like italicized and they're different. And like by the end of the book, like you have this growing dread because you kind of get hints of like something is happening that we don't know, and it's all coming together by the end. And so I just kind of wanted to do that, of showing that there's more happening in this world than your main character knows. And to use it to sort of increase the dread of something's coming, something's happening, what are we going to do? But then to still be able to stay really close to Jenna through all of the immediate action. So that was sort of my like reasoning behind what I did.
So KayLynn's right, where when you do multiple point of view in fantasy, it's normally for like to get more of the world and like people in different spots. But I actually did the dual point of view in Casting Firelight, all for basically the romance. See, my characters don't know who they are. So I wanted both perspectives, so they would each have moments where the reader knows and yet the audience doesn't, so that the plot line would drive more from the question of like, how are these two going to find out, instead of your normal like who done it or what's happening questions. But the book really has kind of two main plots. It has the fantasy plot of like what's going on, and then the romance plot. And but the dual point of view perspective is mostly hitting those romantic beats, so that I could get into both characters' heads and you could really see both of them falling for each other.
So the perspective of Fractured Tide, it started off, I wrote 100 pages of this as a straightforward first person present tense narrative. And it just wasn't working, and I couldn't quite put my finger on what it was. I was already tired of my story, and I had learned enough at that point. That was my fourth full manuscript, that I thought, I know when to throw it away and start over. So I did. And at the time, I was reading a book called Cloud Atlas. They made a movie out of it with Tom Hanks. And one of those stories it's 6 stories, and one of them is a epistolary novel. It's just all told in a letter. And I thought, that is so interesting that it's a story told to one person. And how do you change your story if you have an audience of one? And I got fascinated with that idea. And also her internal conflict it has so much to do with family. The original title of this story was The Wreck, because it had 2 meanings. It was the wreck that she was diving on, but her family was a wreck. It was really messed up, and she wanted to put it back together again. So it made sense for her to tell this story to her dad. And part of it also, it allowed her to be, she's unreliable, because what kinds of things, if you're telling your dad something, or a parent, what are you gonna leave out? What might you not say? And I found that to be really interesting to do. And it made a couple things tricky. So one, there's a lot of scuba diving in this story, but her father's a dive master. So she couldn't explain anything, because he wouldn't need an explanation. So I had to find really tricky ways to make sure an audience out there that maybe had never been diving would know what the equipment was. That was the first thing. The second thing was, there's a subplot, a romantic subplot. I love romantic subplots. So there's a scene when the characters kiss, and I thought, all right, now I'm gonna write this scene, and I thought, oh my gosh, she's not gonna describe a kiss to her dad. How am I going to do that? So it was really tricky. I had to do it in metaphor. And she had to say things like, okay, Dad, I'll spare you the details, just so that, and I know that there was there was something I had to give up there. It became not an immersive experience for the reader. that would kind of bump them out of the story. At the same time, I tried to add something in metaphorically that was uplifting and reflective. So, but yeah, point of view when you decide to do an epistolary novel, it really changes the story.
What led you to change the novel's name from The Wreck to Fractured Tide instead?
You do not get to choose your title. I know that sounds surprising when I've told people that, but most publishers don't let you pick your title. And they said I think they thought The Wreck was too close to other books out there. And so they said, hey, please come up with a list. And because I'm an overachiever, I wrote, I think, 35 titles and then showed them to my friends and said, what do you think? Are these good? And they would vote on, like, this is good, this is terrible. And I got a short list of 10, gave it to the publisher, and they didn't use any of them. So I think the only thing I got in there was the word fractured. So I had it said the fractured sea, and they came up with Fractured Tide. I'm like, okay.
So clearly your books have changed a lot from the original ideas. So how have they progressed to become the books you publish, either during the publishing process or when you were the only one working on it?
Yeah, so my title actually, since we're on titles, my title actually changed too, but instead of them forcing me, the title before was Witchery, and I hated it, and I came up with it, so it's shame on me, right? But I basically told my editor, we need to change this, and she's like, oh, okay. And so I gave a list of 5, saying Cast and Firelight was my favorite, and she's like, sure. So it's not always Leslie's case where they're like, no. But yeah, sometimes, they do want a better title. Bound by Firelight actually came about when I was talking to my agent about Cast and Firelight. She's like, yeah, the sequel could be something like Bound by Firelight. And I was like, that's so perfect. And I never got pushback. I just got what I wanted on that. But other than the title, the book actually changed a lot from when I got an agent. I rewrote the last, all the resolution chapters, which is the last 10,000 words of the book. To make it, instead of a cliffhanger, to make it more tying up bows so that it could stand on its own. And that's because when you go out in submission to publish a book, you don't know if it's going to be picked up, and you don't know if it'll ever be published or get a sequel. So a lot of times they ask you to, make it where it could be a standalone if they just decide never to publish anymore in the series. So yeah, that was the biggest change that my agent actually led me on.
And I also think you're just better at titles than I am. Anyway.
For me, for my book, it actually changed a lot from the first draft until the final draft was probably 20 big, massive revisions and rewrites. And that was partly because I didn't really know what I was doing when I wrote my first draft. I was just I'm just going to write this story, and structure, pacing. Do we need those? Yes, you do. Turns out. So there was a lot of changes. Everything from characters that just sort of melted away into the background because they happened in scenes that I didn't need anymore, merging 2 characters into one character so that this one character could be stronger and do all of the work that they needed to do. The Wild didn't have any magic until one of the very last drafts that I did with my editor at Delacourt. And it was really interesting because so I'm an editor, so editing is my thing. I'm not afraid to take out anything and change it. Not a big deal for me. Still a lot of work, but mentally it's kind of exciting for me. But the thing that stayed the same was the feel of the story. And even though I got to know the main character better through every revision and every draft, she stayed the same. It was just me coming to know her better as the author. And so being able to tell her story and to sort of tailor that story to her as I revised and found out new things about her was really cool. So she was kind of always the anchor, even though a lot around her changed.
Okay, so our third teen who couldn't make it, I have her list of questions. And so this is not really from me. I want to make that clear. It's from her because I am not a writer. I wish I was, but she wanted to ask, she says, I love writing for myself in my free time, but I could never begin to imagine sharing my work with others. How did you overcome any fears you had about publishing your work and learn to write for yourself?
So I can start. So I started writing when I was really young. Like I knew I wanted to be an author when I was 7, and then I started writing when I was like 11 or 12. And around that age, like the fear hadn't hit me yet. And then in high school, like, you know, grown-ups would be like, that's a hard career, that's not stable. And, you know, would basically say, don't do that. And then there's just like a few incidents. So I started just not talking about it. I would just write quietly and not tell anybody. And, you know, that's something you can do. I mean, I wouldn't say it's like a bad thing to not, you know, vocalize it all over the place. But I just, you know, quietly, like I knew I wanted to do this so badly that I just trudged ahead. And I wouldn't say like the fear is gone. It's just overcome with, I want my stories out in the world and I want to write stories and I want people to experience them with me and talk to me about them. So a lot of it's just the passion overcoming the fear. But I would say, yeah, there's always the fear of someone hating it or being hurt or impacted negatively by my stories.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, you go, Leslie.
I would get very afraid of showing it to anyone because I was so afraid they were going to tell me that it was terrible, any of my writing, and that somehow that would be an indication that I wasn't meant to be doing this, that if I got a bad review, somebody telling me it was no good, that, oh, see, it's a sign I shouldn't do this. And what I realized is it's very important to have a growth mentality as a writer. A fixed mentality is a very damaging thing. You're not born with a set of skills that make you a good writer. That's kind of a myth. You develop them over time, and every day is Groundhog Day. Every day is a day that you can be better at what you're doing. And having that growth mentality is so important. And so I would adopt this idea of do something every day that scares you. I ended up going to a writers convention called the DFW Con and putting myself out there. And that changed my life because I became involved with a writers group called DFW Writers Workshop, that every Wednesday we read our work out loud. And I would read with my heart about to be out of my chest because I was afraid. And it was all okay. And I try to remind myself that there's this great quote from Hugh Laurie, an actor. I can't remember the whole thing, but he says, I think it's a terrible thing to wait until you are ready. And he goes on to say a few more things, and he says, I think the longer I think about it, the longer I live, the longer I know there is no such thing as ready. There is only now. And you might as well do it now, because now is as good a time as any. And I remind myself of that I shouldn't wait for some kind of magical, confident, ready feeling. To just throw yourself out there because you have something to say. And yeah, so that's how I deal with that feeling, for sure. Putting yourself out there is hard, and even once you're published, that hardback cover is not armor. It still hurts if I get a bad review and somebody didn't like it. It's like, oh, but you know what? It's okay, because the people who didn't like it are few, and the ones who did are many. So it's okay.
I love all of that. I would just add that knowing, for me anyway, knowing why I write, like, why am I telling stories? Why am I telling this story? Knowing that why is something that motivates me to like deal with that anxiety and like do it anyway. But like, it's okay to just write for yourself because you like it. Like, that's okay too. Like, that is wonderful writing that is serving its purpose. So it's important to remember that too. And then along the ways, as you sort of baby step out of your comfort zone with, like, for me, it was like, let my sister read it. She likes me. She'll like me no matter what. Like, I'm going to let her read it. And then baby stepping out to like this is a friend that I have that reads a lot. Like, let's see what she says. Like, and then until you get to the point where you're like, hey, I have this piece of garbage, please read it and rip it apart because I just want to get better, right? Like, it's kind of a baby step of widening your comfort circle as you go. And then learning to recognize that there are good critiques and there are bad critiques, and that you want to find the people to read your work that are in your corner, that are going to make you feel excited and uplifted, and like, not like you're garbage, but like, oh, there was a problem in the story, but like, let's brainstorm ways to fix it, right? So there's good feedback and there's bad feedback, and learning to discern between those is really important too.
It's funny you say your sister, because the first beta I ever had was in high school. I gave it to my mom, and she doesn't like fantasy. She doesn't read fantasy. So she was just like, I don't like this. And so I was like, okay, I need to find like my people, or people who would actually like young adult fantasy. So for those that don't know, Leslie and I know each other through the DFW Writers Workshop. So it was people like Leslie and others in the Dallas area that were like, oh, actually, you should keep writing this story because we like it. And just like, if I can just write for one person, knowing like they want the next installment or they want the next chapter, for me, like, that's all I need. So try to find like, at least, even if it's not a family member, because sometimes family members aren't the place to go, but just to find friends or someone to keep you going.
I thought we might be short on time, but I'll pose another question if that's all right. Just like some general advice for aspiring writers once more, but how do you find this balance between introspection, description, as well as dialogue when developing a character? I know from like my nominal work, like time as being a quasi writer, I like really struggled with that for finding and developing a character. So what would your advice be for that?
I can go. So if I got this right, how do you balance introspection and dialogue and all of that? I think in the craft itself, for me, there was a lot of trial and error, and reading it out loud is very helpful because you can start to feel when it drags. So, and then if you've got dialogue that's super fast paced, but it's not connected to anything, it's not anchored to a place, and there's no movement or expression, you can feel it. And it really is trial and error over and over. And there are certain things that I have a harder time with that require more revision. So dialogue is a bit of a weakness on a first draft for me. And I find I have to do many drafts. And eventually, with trying it and then giving it to beta readers, getting reactions, trying it again, and then boom, finally. So the combination of having a good beta reader and then reading it out loud and seeing, do I have a scene that I can complete in approximately 15 minutes that has a complete arc? Or have I put so much description in it and so much navel gazing and thoughts that I can't even get to the 15-minute mark and have anything real happen? So that really helps, knowing how long your audience's attention span is. The modern attention span's a lot shorter than 100 years ago. Mine is as well. So that really helps to kind of understand what the audience is looking for in terms of chunks of time.
I had an agent, I pitched to this agent, and it was like a manuscript consult. So she like looked at the first 10 pages of my manuscript, and it was like a big scary step for me, like letting this really professional person look at my first chapter. And she gave me the advice of taking different colored highlighters, so print it out and just highlight, where's your action, where's your dialogue, where is your like your internal thought, and just like highlight them in different colors. And it's a very visual way of seeing it on the page of like, oh, this is all yellow, I need to break it up or mix it up. And then just as I go, like thinking about like ways that I can get closer to the character, and how can I, like, just making sure every single thing that's on the page is getting us closer to the character and like increasing the conflict. But then what Leslie said, like sometimes you're just too close to it as the author, and it's the work of revision of like getting feedback from other readers, because like it's all in your head. So sometimes it's hard to see it clearly. So getting feedback from other people and then just revising it again and again and again until it's right. It rarely comes for me on the first try, like rarely.
So as a young writer, I would always hear like the show versus tell, and like show and don't tell and all this stuff. And for a while that would really like hurt my writing, because I'd want to show everything then, and the pacing would then be a failure. So I now think of it as like narrate versus dramatize. So that introspection and some of that like thought process, like if it's voicey and is doing its work, that's great narration. And you need a balance of that, as well as, you know, dramatizing the scenes and really like showing every, you know, facial expression and what's going on exactly. So yeah, on the big moments of the story, it should always be dramatized. And then sometimes you can narrate through, but no book should have no narration. It can't be all dialogue and action, because then we just don't get any thoughts of what's happening with the character, and we lose a lot of point of view. So yeah, if that helps, sometimes it's best to like just go through and highlight, like KayLynn said, or like try see something new. So if the advice you're not getting of like, oh, the show don't tell, like I don't understand how that works, just try to see from it from a different perspective, and read a lot too. Like just other stories, I know, can help you a lot with how other people do it.
Dana makes a great point. So you're going to hear, for those writers out there, you're going to hear a lot of advice, and don't think of them as rules so much, as it's a good guideline until you break it, and it works even though you broke the rule. So sometimes voice is, when you're creating voice in a story, you are telling sometimes, and if it works, it works. So that's really, what's your rule? Did it work? Okay, then it's all right. Did it entertain your audience? And I've seen really great writers break rules left and right in interesting ways that it actually worked. So I would definitely be wary of anybody who says you can't do this, or you can't use adverbs, or you can't start with a waking up scene. That's kind of one of those rules that agents say, I don't want a scene where somebody's waking up in the morning. But I also am an editor, and I edited a book, and the main character woke up in a car that was teetering on the edge of a cliff, and she couldn't remember who she was. And the opening chapter is her trying to get out of the car, and the guy who's unconscious next to her, and she doesn't even know who he is before the thing falls. That's a good waking up scene. So, you know, you can break the rule. You just have to figure out a way to entertain your audience while you're doing it.
Can I say, as a reader, I went to a conference and I got to hear R.L. Stine speak, and I'm sure a lot of people in our audience have read the Goosebumps books, but it was really funny. He talked about somebody, I guess, told him that old adage of write what you know. And he said he thought that was a huge load of bunk, because he said, every story I've ever written, I didn't ever experience that in my life, but you know, this is what was coming through his imagination. And I thought that was really interesting, because I think that's a huge piece of writing advice that's out there. Do you guys think? I mean, that idea that you write what you know.
I mean,
yeah, I agree. Like, oh, go.
No, you.
I agree, especially in writing fantasy worlds. It's like I'm making up fantasy worlds, and like I'm making up creatures or like magic and stuff. And so it's all up here anyway. So I never know it. But then I base a lot of it. Like I was a fencer in college, so some of those fighting scenes I draw from, but there's tons of scenes where, you know, I did it. This is a really embarrassing fact, but I wrote my first book in high school. And I wrote a kissing scene before I was kissed. And I was like, what am I supposed to do? But I want, like, so yeah, I think sometimes that's why it takes a while, because we do have to have life experiences to try to relate themes and emotions on the page. But yeah, you can totally write outside of what you know.
I was just going to say, it depends on, like for me, it's like, I only experience life through my own vision, my own lens, my own experiences. So sometimes writing what you know is a matter of like taking those feelings and those emotions, or even those experiences, and breaking it down to something more universal and like getting down to its core, and then building it back up a different way. So like my main character gets lost in this kind of menacing forest, and like I've never been lost in a forest like that before, but like I have felt lost in my life. So it's like taking those emotions and putting it in this situation that I've never been in, as a way of like taking something that I know, but putting it, like creating something else out of it, if that makes sense.
Totally. I think, Bianca, your point was correct. Why don't we have you guys go down and just talk a little bit about your next work, or what you're working on right now. And then after that, we will open it up for questions from the audience. Whoever wants to stay, let's start with you.
Sure. So for me, up next in 6 months, this book comes out, Bound by Firelight. Because of an error of editing, I actually just returned in the first pass pages, which means it should go into e-arc versions hopefully this month or so people can start reading it. Other than that, the next thing is still kind of unknown, whether, you know, that be in the series or a new thing, by him working on another fantasy book. So I will definitely be working on other YA fantasies in the future, hopefully.
Awesome.
Yeah, there is no sequel to Fractured Tide. It's a standalone. So I am writing something in the same vein. It is thriller / horror, YA. And right now it's titled The Dark Place. And it's about a psychic. He's a guy. So I wrote a male main character, which was fun for me. He is psychic. He lives in a small South Texas town, and he comes across a haunted safe, and he really shouldn't open it. And of course he does. So that's mostly what this is about. But it definitely has something to do with, so you have what's in the safe, the cursed safe, and you also have this lonely town in dark sky country, which I'm in love with the desert as much as I'm in love with the sea, because they're both vast, lonely places. So I really dive into the imagery of the desert and the night sky in the way that I dove into the image of the reef and the image of the ocean in Fractured Tide. So it's finished, and it is with my agent. I think it's draft 6. So I'm crossing my fingers that this is gonna work. And then after that, I was thinking about writing a middle grade. I have read some really great middle grade lately, and I'm toying with the idea of doing that next.
Cool.
So for me, my next book, it's the last book in the Shielded duology. It's called Untethered. It's coming out 2 weeks from today, and I'm super excited about it. It's a lot of fun. So that's coming out in 2 weeks, but I'm also working on like my next book, right? And it's another YA fantasy, and it's about a cursed boy who is trying to save his sister, and another girl who has to stop him from saving his sister in order to save her village. So there's like lots of conflict, lots of tension. It's a big, vast, sweeping world. And it's been a lot of fun to work on so far. But let's hope we find someone who wants to publish it. So it's kind of a fun, an unknown. I'm standing on the edge of a cliff. We'll see what happens.
Well, good luck to all of you guys. It's been great having you give us all the advice and the insights. So for our listeners out there, if you guys have any questions, please feel free to either put them in the chat or raise your hand or unmute yourself if you feel comfortable doing that and ask your question.
Do you guys have any what's it called, like advice for young authors who don't exactly know what they're doing but trying to figure out what to like write and do?
Thanks, Tanvi. Who would like to take that one?
I can pitch in something. So for me, everything that I learned about writing was from going to writing conferences. Like my major was English, but it wasn't English literature. I didn't take a single writing class in any of my schooling ever. It was more linguistics and editing. So like having a good grasp of like the language. So I do think knowing, like as a writer, the tools that you use to communicate your story, like it's very important to like know your tools and like have a good grasp of like grammar and how to craft a sentence. But I also think there are a lot of really great resources for teens and younger writers. There's a writing conference specifically for teens that I taught at in March, and it's called Teen Author Boot Camp. And it's like fantastic. Like Lee Bardugo and Julie Berry were keynotes. There were some other ones and now I'm like blanking on their names, but like really fantastic resources out there for teen writers specifically. And they're all like, most of them are all online now or hybrid so that they are more accessible no matter like your physical location.
Was that in Utah, KayLynn?
Yeah, it takes place in, I think it's Provo, Utah, but it was online. It was virtual this year and last year.
Okay. Yeah, I think there's a lady, a author that just moved here right before the pandemic who told me about that. She had moved from Utah and I know it was teen boot camp. I'm almost positive. So that's cool. That's awesome. Is that something they have to pay for or is it a free option?
I think you do have to pay for it. I don't think it is as expensive as some, and I think there are a lot of scholarships available.
So my advice would be that and this comes from making mistakes and then realizing, oh, that wasn't the way to do that, is to get rid of your perfectionism. If you have that trait, it'll really destroy your self-confidence as you go through this, because it's a very messy, imperfect process, writing. And so I would say you want to be focused on the process rather than the product, and set yourself regular goals that are achievable. Like, I'm going to write 15 minutes a day, or I'm going to write 15 minutes 3 times a week, or, oh, now I'm going to increase it to 30 minutes, but something where you can actually reach that goal. And once you reach it, then it can buoy your confidence. Because I think that some people give up on writing because they feel beat down by rejection, they had this crazy goal, I'm going to write 3 hours every day for 7 days a week all year, and then they don't reach it and they feel bad about themselves. And that's a really high goal. So focus on that. I think having good writing habits, focusing on getting good habits, is one of the best things you can do for yourself as a writer. Figure out when you write best and try to find time to do that, and do it often. It's better to write for 15 minutes 5 times a week than to try to write for 4 hours on a Saturday. Doing it more regularly, it's almost like a workout. You have to do it more regularly for a shorter period to get your skills to grow. So that would be my advice.
And I just want to add, when I was writing when I was young, it was mostly for fun. And I feel like sometimes there's this idea of like, well, I want to get published later. But the book you're working on right now, like really just have fun with it, because when you do get published, it's deadlines and getting things in fast and feeling the pressure. And there is something magical about just being in your own space, you know, maybe talking to a friend or two or something, and just focusing on the story and really just having fun, so that you can, that passion you have now is like a light that will not burn out and you don't get burned out by it.
She makes a great point. As a matter of fact, when I used to have a lot of fun when I was first creating stories as a teen, and none of those ever got published. But when I draft today, I always get a pen and a notebook, just like I did when I was a teenager, because it kind of grounds me. And this is a place where I feel good and happy. And I can't, a lot of people draft on a computer. I can't actually, I do longhand and then I end up typing it. And I think it's because it just reminds me of the fun I used to have. And sometimes as a professional author, it can be a slog. There are parts of it where you think, this is just not fun anymore. This is revision 65 and I'm done. You can always kind of fall back on your formative experiences. So yes, what Dana said.
It looks like we had a question come up in chat. It says, hello, if you were to write a story just for fun, how would you come up with the plot line or any of the characters? Thanks, Mackenzie, for the question.
Oh, I'm gonna quickly go. I take my very favorite tropes and just put them in a pot. And that's how I did Cast and Firelight. So I was like, I love arranged marriages. I love mistaken identities. I like secret identities. So really, like, I would go up to an agent and be like, so my book is like Batman, Marvel meets like You've Got Mail. And agents would be like, what the heck? I'd be like, oh, okay, sorry. But that's really what it is. I just love like putting things together that I love. So like, if you love romantic tropes and stuff, like put them into your book, create scenarios and scenes that you want to see. But yeah, a lot of times like fresh YA, which is a lot of times what's getting published, is just taking two tropes you don't think would go together and putting them together.
I would also add, for me, it usually starts with like a single like spark of inspiration. It's usually like a person in a place experiencing some big emotion. And then you can ask questions. So like there was this time I was like driving down the street and there was this little girl and she was walking along the sidewalk. And then there was a house and the yard had like just a little hill in it. Like it was very small, like maybe it had landscaping at one point, but it was just grass. And she left the sidewalk so that she could walk up the hill and then go back down and then go back on the sidewalk. And I was like, who is this girl? Why is she choosing to like go walk up that hill when she had a flat, straight path in front of her? Why did she do that? Like, where is she going? What does she want to be when she grows? Like just asking questions about that. Like what's stopping her from becoming who she wants to be? Like just things like that of just asking questions from that like single spark of inspiration. And then like Dana said, like taking fun tropes that you love and putting twists on them that are kind of unexpected and fresh.
I think for me, I like to pick some kind of activity that I love to do. So for Fractured Tide, that was scuba diving. I love this sport. It's just so much fun. And for my new book, The Dark Place, it's rock climbing. So I just, being outside, being with nature, just, so I often, that's part of what I do. If I were, however, to write a book just completely for fun, I would probably write I love stories where the main character is in our world, but gets sucked into a portal and gets thrown into a fantasy world where suddenly she finds out she's just way cooler than she thought she was. And she can use her sword and suddenly, you know, she ends up being princess of the kingdom or something like that. I don't know if I'll ever write that book, but I love those kinds of books. So, and as a teenager, I used to fantasize about that happening. I thought, oh, wouldn't it be great if I just woke up one day and I'm in the forest and suddenly, where am I? What am I wearing? So that would be a lot of fun.
That gave me a lot of Narnia vibes for some reason, but I don't know. From the chat, Tomby also asked, how do you build characters and their traits and hobbies? Is there a specific way you keep track of it all?
Should I go first? I don't want to always go first if other people want to go first. Like, you think I'm bad in like in-person interactions, like Zoom interactions is just that much worse. So I'm sorry. So for me, I really like giving my characters personality tests and just asking them questions that maybe even don't make sense in their world, or like it's not something that's going to happen to them in their story, but I kind of pull them out of their story and ask them questions. And like, it sounds kind of weird, but then just like listen for the answer that comes. And then I always write everything down. And I am not great at keeping track of digital organization. But I try and keep everything written down. As I'm brainstorming and stuff, I just have like a note in my phone that I will just write everything down, and then I'll take it into like a Word document and organize it into less chaos. And then I have it in sections. I used Scrivener to draft. It's a writing program, and it just has a different visual layout for writing and drafting. So I kind of keep track of things in there and add to it as I go. But yeah, for me, getting to know characters is partially like asking them questions and doing a lot of work beforehand of like, oh, this is how you feel. Why do you feel this way? Do you like rock music or do you hate it? Do you like this dessert that I'm eating right now, or do you not? Like just random things like that to help you get to know them better, and then listening for the answers. And I was going to say something else and I forgot, so we'll let other people go.
Yeah, I kind of do what KayLynn does, but instead of like personality tests, I let the character have a conversation with another character in the book, so that it feels like I'm actually working and writing and actually doing the work. And even if that scene never happens, at least like, so a lot of their voice comes through writing. That's why I'm kind of a pantser, because I have to write to really feel the character. But there are a lot of like hobbies and things, like I don't know my character's like favorite ice cream flavor, but because like it's not on the page, so I don't have like a list of like every single trait. And so when people ask me like Starbucks flavors, I'm like, I don't know, there's no Starbucks in the world, so I didn't think of that. But you can do like lists, and I keep a journal of, you know, make sure like I know her character flaws and her the biggest things that she's worried about and what she wants and her goals, because I feel like that character driven want and goal creates agency in the story, and that's always how to get a really good like plot line going, when your character has agency and wants something.
Yeah, I'm a little bit more like Dana. And actually, I used to try to do the list thing because I saw some advice online. Hey, here are some character sheets. Fill these out for each of your characters. And it didn't work for me. And it could work for some people, but it just didn't for me. So I actually have my characters, and I found this out the hard way because I didn't do this before the first draft, and then had to go back and do it and fix the characters because they were boring. And especially in the new one I'm writing, I had a problem with a couple of characters and had to go back and just do some doctoring. I have them write journal entries, sort of like what Dana does with dialogue, but they are just writing in a diary. And one of the things that I focus on is, what does this character want on a normal day? On a normal day, when the world is not exploding, when there isn't this huge conflict or an exploded boat, what do they want in life? What are they about? What is the burning desire of their heart? And try to write about that. Every character that you put on the big ones, try to know what they care about. And that will inform how they behave, how they talk. And also it's helpful, if I find it helpful, is writing thrillers. If your characters have wounds, it adds some depth to the dread, and it sort of reflects the dread of the book. So, you know, what happened to them earlier in their life that really might have damaged them, and you can write about that. And I think that helps. That's how I've been able to, and once you do that, they feel real. They feel like you know them. Like you could just call them on the phone, because now they feel like a real person, and they come to life on the page much easier that way.
I remembered what I was going to say. I was going to say that sometimes like it's really important to do all of this pre-work, but you're never going to completely know your character, I feel, until you like write it and like get them on the page and get to the end of the draft. And that's okay. There's a lot of creative work that's happening as you draft, and you're never going to have all your best ideas. Like your first ideas aren't always going to be your best ideas. So for me, it's important to be open to listening to those characters if they go a way that I didn't expect them to go, of listening to them and figuring out why they're doing what they're doing if they happen to veer. So yeah, that was just.
Amira asked if you have ever had writer's block, and if you have, how do you get over it? I have something to add to this question, but I'll add it after you answer. So
for me, I feel like I hit a writer's block at like 20% of the book. And because I write like 100,000 words, I'm always like, yep, 20,000 words, it's here. And then I hit it at the 60%, which is like 60,000 words. And it's normally the break into Act 1 to Act 2 and Act 2 to Act 3. And how I deal with it is I say, okay, I'm stopping here, and I just jump to whatever scene I want to write. And normally that informs something. So like if my middle is just not working, like I don't know what the middle is, I'll jump to like climactic scenes I'm excited about, or like a romantic scene I'm excited about, so that I can still be writing. Because if I go for like weeks without writing, the voices kind of start leaving my head. So, but even if I'm not writing every day, but I'm thinking about the story, or I'm like talking through scenes, then at least like they'll still be talking in my head potentially, and I'll get a good line of dialogue that will inspire me to, create a new scene.
Yeah, Dana's point about writing often, the thing about writing often is that your subconscious will work on the problems of your story while you're getting coffee or doing your laundry or going jogging. You actually, my best idea, I'll write in the morning, and then I go take a shower, and I have to get out of the shower to write down dialogue that I've just thought of. Because I don't know, your mind, your subconscious will start putting out all this great stuff. So she's right about doing it often. Don't let writer's block make you not write for 2 weeks. And one of the ways I get over it is I have to actually remind myself that it is okay if what I write today isn't good. I remind myself, you know what, I'm going to write today, and I might just crumble it up and throw it in the trash, and it doesn't mean anything. And I'm just going to write today. I'm going to write for 15 minutes, and I'm going to write for an hour, longhand if I have to. And it's okay if it doesn't work. So, and I think when I used to let writer's block would floor me for a month, I wouldn't write a thing. That was many years ago. And I think it was because the terror of seeing my own, I'd see, oh, this is terrible. I shouldn't be doing it. And then you start going down that rabbit hole of kicking yourself because you think you're not meant to do this. And again, growth mentality is very important. You are meant to do this. And everybody can have a bad day or even a bad week. So the point is just get something on the page. You don't have to keep it.
I really like everything that Dana and Leslie said. I will add one more maybe factor. I think sometimes you have writer's block because the story isn't working for some reason. And I think sometimes you can have writer's block because you are emotionally drained. And this isn't always the case. So I feel like it's kind of a situation of being like really honest with yourself and kind of introspective with how are you doing? Like last year was a really great example of, there were a lot of people who like during the pandemic, they just couldn't write because their baseline stress levels had just risen and they just stayed there all day, every day. And so I think being aware and really honest with yourself of like, sometimes you just need a break. Sometimes you need to step away and like, let your subconscious work on it without like pressure of like, I got to get this, I got to get it now. Like all of these things that are pressuring you to like try to force the story. And so when you do feel like that, to take the time to fill up your creative well, and do the things that re-energize you so that you can get back into it and have fun, and kind of trust that love for writing will come back. It's not like if you lose it, then it's lost forever. It just means you're going through something and you need to process it and then you can come back to it, right? So just like being really honest with yourself and knowing the difference between I am emotionally exhausted and I need to take a break versus it's hard and I don't want to do it tonight because I don't feel like I would rather sit on the couch and watch a show. Like knowing the difference in yourself between those, to sort of help you. I mean, because writing should be fun, right? Like it should be something that you're excited and energized and looking forward to. And so if you're emotionally in a place where like you have to take a pause for a second, that's okay.
A small little tip also I want to add was, if I'm really not feeling it, like I want to just like watch TV or something, sometimes I'll just open the document and just read a little bit of what I've written before. And normally it starts jogging ideas. But sometimes the hardest thing is opening that document and not doing something else. But yeah, sometimes I just open it just to make sure, like doing the act of clicking it and then reading at least a paragraph or two.
That, you know, you make a good point about you got to be self-aware enough to know why you're blocked. And if you really are just depleted, then yeah, you should definitely, sometimes the field just has to lie fallow a little bit. But you know, if it's a different reason, like lack of confidence, then you have to recognize that. So she makes a really good point. Sometimes it's okay to take a break, and you have to give yourself a break. Oh, and what Dana was saying about reading what you've written, what I also find helpful is reading an author I love, getting back into a book, and that's how I wanted to become, when I first wanted to become a writer, it happened when I was reading somebody's book and thought, this is so awesome. This book is not just fun, this book is important to me. This book is a cushion for my emotions. It's an amazing thing I'll never forget. I want to do this too. So if I'm pretty blocked, I'll read poetry, or I'll read a novel that I just love.
What I want to add is, as you guys know, a lot of authors have those days where they can't stop writing, even if it means skipping meals. And they also have those days where they cannot write a single word. I've heard about this in many author interviews previously, but do you ever like have a fear that you've written the last word for a long time and that you might not write again?
I can start on this one. I feel like I'm a little baby writer still. I feel like I have a lot of ideas out there. I think the fear for me personally isn't that I will never write again. It's I will never write something that publishers will want to publish again, because it's very subjective. So I will always try to write the best that I can, and I will always try to write the things that I love and feel are important to me. But there's that fear of, will a publishing company in like New York or somewhere feel like they can make money off of this idea, right? It's kind of a lot of pressure when you think too hard about it. So that it's not for me, it's not that I won't ever write again, because I will, because I love it. And writing is kind of a way that I process life and experience things. And but it's just more that hope that I'll be able to share my stories with other people.
Yeah, KayLynn said exactly what I was going to say. It's not, oh, this will be the last word I write. It's the last published word I write. but that's because we're all at like this crossroads of like, we don't have the next deal, waiting for us. And a lot of authors go through this where you have to sell something else. So a lot of it now, I think this is a good time to talk about like market and trends. A lot of things now I have to like filter my ideas through what the market wants and what are the trends. Sometimes like sci-fi dystopians like not selling right now. 5 years ago vampires weren't selling, but now they are coming back. So like, it's just sometimes you have to, and if you're writing a story that's not on market right now, you can always just shelve it, and maybe it'll come back into focus. So just because you're being rejected a lot could mean you are an amazing writer. It's just not what the market wants. So like Cats and Firelight, when you really boil it down, it's a superhero story, but we didn't market it as a superhero story because superhero stories weren't selling 2 years ago. And even today, like a lot of superhero stories, don't sell too well. So yeah, sometimes you just have to kind of like market it differently or pitch it differently too.
Yeah, I've had that feeling before, of the same feeling Dana and KayLynn had of, I'm always going to write, but is this the last? I get that fear of, is this the last thing that I will publish? And I also think about trend, what's on trend now. So I have, in my head, I have this Venn diagram, and in one bubble are all the things that will sell. In another bubble are all the things I want to write. And I just, I overlay them. I try to write into that sweet spot. So for example, I have a book I really love, and my agent thinks it won't sell, so it's just shelved. And then I'm writing this one, which has some, the dark place, the rock climbing psychic teenager in a small Texas town, is has some flavor of supernatural in it, a little bit, not totally, but. And so I think that she thinks this is sort of the male narrator and the older brother is going to be something that people will want to read. But yeah, I know I have friends who have written beautiful, beautiful books that they can't get anybody to look at because they're not something people are reading right now. So that's something to remember. Just because some publisher or an agent hasn't picked you doesn't mean you're not a wonderful writer.
We had a kind of a technical question come through the chat. And I know we're getting close to the end of time, but I think this is a quick question you guys can answer. Isha asked, I'm sorry if I said your name incorrectly. What kind of writing software do you guys use if you work on a computer, like to edit or create your work?
Microsoft Word. I love Microsoft Word. That's all I use pretty much.
Yeah, me too. I just use Microsoft Word, which I know is weird because I feel like a lot of people use Scrivener, which is what KayLynn is going to say. But yeah, I just have multiple documents of like, oh, I'm about to throw out this paragraph. I like put it in the unused document so I don't delete it. I just put it in this like 30,000 word document that will never see the light of day.
Yeah, I'm about to be an ad for Scrivener, but I'm a visual person and I really like, but part of the thing that I struggle with is not being able to see the whole story at the same time. Like in Word, you have this much and then you scroll and you have the next much and then like the next bit. So for me visually, Scrivener, which you can buy online, I think it's like $40 or something. And like it's not a huge, like big expensive thing. In my perspective, I guess, but you can like see everything in different ways, and you can, it just kind of helps me break up the story a little bit easier in my head, and it's easier to move things around. So I always draft in Scrivener, but I actually usually revise in Word because I love the track changes feature in Word so that I can like see what I'm changing and I can like flip between them to be like, is this better? Or is this just different? So I usually draft in Scrivener and I revise in Word.
Sahasra or Bianca, did you guys have any other questions come through in chat?
Yeah, so Jessica asks, what are your writing routines and how long did it take for you to find a writing routine that worked for you?
I am an early morning person, and I figured that out after a lot of trial and error, that by the end of the day, I have night owl friends, but I have nothing left at the end of the day. I just want potato chips and bad TV. I don't want to create anything. So I actually like, and it sounds nuts, but I like to get up at 5 in the morning sometimes. And because it's dark, nobody's asking anything of me. And you know, even if if that's hard for you, I find after 5 minutes and a cup of coffee, I'm ready to go. And I find I can write more productively and ideas come fresher. So I'm definitely a morning person. I try to do it every morning. Take one day off a week.
I'm the exact opposite. I write really late at night. I did that because in high school, I'd wake up early for school. So I wasn't going to wake up at 5, like I couldn't do it. And then I would go through the day, extracurriculars, homework. And then that was the only time, weekends and at night. And it just I became a night owl because of that. And now I just really like, again, it's finding like that quiet where like no one's going to interrupt you. I think that's like the sweet spot, but whether that be early in the morning or late at night.
And I don't know if you could call anything that I do a habit because I have 4 kids. I have a lot of demands on my time. In order to wake up before them, I'd have to wake up at like 3 a.m. because they all wake up really early. So for me, it's about taking the time that I do have and making it work. And sometimes it hurts my brain because I have to focus on I have to sit down and focus, even though I know I'm not going to really have the time to really get into it like I want to, but it's about taking what I do have and making it work. So.
Okay, I have one last question in the chat. Are you guys okay with one last question, and then we'll call it quits for this meeting? Okay, this is from Tanvi, and she says, how do you create dialogue between two characters, or your characters, sorry, and how do you keep it from becoming repetitive or boring? And then that's gonna be our final question for the day, so take your time.
Okay, oh, you're gonna go? Okay, go ahead, Dana.
No, go. I was going to ask, it was a question about how to create dialogue. Is that the question?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, you can go, Leslie.
So because this is a trouble spot for me, I've had to study it a little bit more. And one thing that really helps is to, I find, don't answer questions directly. So if you have a character who asks a question, the other person shouldn't just say yes. It should be, so there's sort of you can have a twisty way of answering questions. That's one way you can do it. It also helps if Dana is really good at banter. And a lot of that, when you read Cast in Firelight, you'll see that the characters, the way that they answer questions are not what the reader expects. It's not the first thing that you expect they'll say. It's this little clever thing. And it takes a little time to practice that. So that's one thing. Also, to make sure you have a balance of short, rapid fire, because that moves very quickly. And then it's almost like a song. You have a certain pattern to the rapid fire conversation, and then it slows down with longer answers. So be aware of the music that your dialogue is making, what kind of rhythms it's making on the page.
Yep, I agree with everything that they said. As far as like, I don't know, some things that I was thinking about as they were talking. Dialogue on the page won't actually sound like real dialogue in real life. Like if you just try and transcribe a conversation that two people are having, you're not going to want to do that. You want your dialogue to be as like quick and snappy and tight as it can be. Like whether you're in the middle of banter or not, like you want, like in general, you want the fewest amount of words to convey the emotion that you're trying to convey, right? So like people rarely in dialogue in books, you rarely use the other person's name that you're talking to. Something that I like to do is think about why they're saying what they're saying. Like, why are they responding this way? Why are they asking this question? And what does what they're saying say about their character? And then I think, and this maybe isn't quite answering the question, but subtext, like what's happening around those lines of dialogue? How are the characters reacting, both like physically and internally, but also like thought process? How are they reacting? How does what they're saying conflict with like what they're feeling or thinking inside, right? Because sometimes it's not what they're saying that's interesting, it's what they're not saying that's interesting. Yeah, I don't know if that helps.
Oh yeah, subtext. You're totally right. When you have characters who are hiding things, suddenly you have depth to the scene. And that takes a while. When I first started writing dialogue, everything was very surface, and they just said exactly what they were thinking. And then I'd test it, and my beta readers, my really good beta readers, like, yeah, where's your subtext? And it was a skill I had to work on.
Yeah, I agree with everything everyone said. Just to add a few more little tips is, especially the transcribing. Like if you ever, in college, I had to transcribe interviews I did for like my advertising, and oh my gosh, something, just what I'm saying is like a paragraph, and like you never do the paragraph. So if you do have to have like them say a few sentences, I interrupt them a lot. I infuse action tags. And also to make sure there's no like talking heads in a scene, I give them something really interesting to do. Sometimes that's them bonding over a hobby. Sometimes that's something adversary, like in a fight scene. I infuse a lot of like dialogue and banter within fight scenes too, so that the fight scene's not boring. Because sometimes for me, it's, I trust my dialogue's not boring, but I don't trust the rest of the scene to not be boring. So I've got to like make sure they're both engaging.
Can I add one more thing as well? If you like try reading your dialogue out loud, like with like how your characters are saying it, their reactions. If you're tripping up or if you're getting bored while you're reading it, your reader is gonna like, it's not gonna like click for your reader either. So like reading them out loud is really helpful.
Okay, I'm sorry, you guys. So Sahasra had one more question in the chat. This is it, I promise, last one.
Harshita, I want to know, what was the process to come up with the names of the characters in your story?
So I go online to like baby.com and things like that to, you know, so when I first draft, I really don't care about names, obviously, because my title for the book was bad too. I mean, I just don't care. Like, I'll put in the most simple name ever, and then later I'll infuse it with something way better. And then for like Jasmine's name, I had it full first draft was something else. And then my husband and I like sat down with like baby.com and like he helped me create a name. And it was like we were picking a name for our child, which is really bizarre. But yeah, I love websites to see like what the meaning of names are, so that like it's a little fun Easter egg when people later might notice that or see that.
And I think for my, I never try to pick names that really have some kind of hidden meaning, but I have a lot of, I'm also a poet. And so I think about how will the number of syllables affect the line. So they're never long. My character in my current book, his name is Quinn. Character in Fractured Tide was Sia, just 2 syllables. I keep those really nice and short because that extra syllable can slow a line down. And I try not to pick too many names that sound alike, so that you don't want Steph and Susie or something, you know, too many S names or that kind of thing. But I also go to baby.com or whatever kind of nameyourbaby.com to get my names.
Yeah, I really like google.com. And I like searching for like period appropriate names. So like if my fantasy has more of a medieval feel, or like thinking about the countries or the places that I'm basing the kingdoms off of, or like that I pull inspiration from. So I'll try and like pull ideas from there, from like searching for historical names from that time period and that time and that place. Or it could be a matter of, sometimes I use Google Translate and I use that to come up with names for things. So I'm trying to think of an example, and of course my mind has gone blank, but taking the word for like bird in Dutch or something, and then like twisting it enough that it's not the word in Dutch anymore, but it's just a different enough that it becomes sort of its own name. And there's a lot of trial and error in that. And then yes, to what Leslie was saying about like, try to make sure they don't like all sound the same. And then one like silly little thing for me is that like, my name is KayLynn, and I've never been able to like, I've never had a really good nickname like ever in my life. And like, I think nicknames are super cool. So like all of my characters kind of have nicknames, and that's like an intentional thing. So like Jenna Sara's name is very long, but her nickname is Jenna, and it flows a little bit better. So like personalize it, like use the internet, like kind of think outside the box, and don't be afraid to, I don't know, just keep trying, like keep changing it until it feels right.
Oh, speaking of nicknames, so my main character actually got renamed, and because her nationality changed to Greek, and so her name is actually, I have a friend who's Greek, Brooke Fossey, who wrote The Big Finish. She's a really great author. And it's her daughter's, so it's actually her daughter's name. And apparently it's a tradition, and it's very common in Greek culture for you to have many nicknames. So her daughter goes by Tessia, Sia, and T. And so that's what I did for the main character of Fractured Tides. Her little brother calls her T. Everybody else calls her Sia, but her mother calls her Sia by that formal name. And so that's actually how that happened.
Cool. Well, we are past our ending time. Thank you guys so much for hanging around. I really appreciate that. So a big thank you to our authors who took part of their day out for us to just share their experience and their writing and their books. If you guys have not read these 3 yet, you need to, because they're awesome. We have all 3 of these titles available at the library. But if you live in Plano or McKinney or surrounding area, check your libraries. I've checked there too, and all 3 books are at other area libraries. So no excuse to not read it. You should go and do it immediately. And also thank you to my 2 volunteers who spent their time reading these authors and also coming up with some questions and helping lead this discussion. We hope you enjoyed it today. Thank you guys for coming out and joining us. We really appreciate it. And we hope to do more virtual author events in the future. So if we can persuade you guys to come back, we'd love to have you again at some point in the future. And we hope everybody has a great day. Any final things you'd like to say before we call it a day?
I just want to thank everyone. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you so much. We really appreciate it. This was a great turnout. It was a lot of fun.
Yep, I'm going to echo. It was really fun to get to chat with you and answer your questions. And thank you for having me.
Awesome.
Thank you, Bianca. Thank you, Sahasra.